Hello, my name is Franz Ferdinand Locker and I work on theoretical plasma physics. You have heard some things about plasma from my colleagues Fabian and Pradeep, and today I'm going to talk to you about magnetic reconnection and what actually happens when field lines meet. So first let me start with the question, what again is a plasma? A plasma normally consists of charged particles. Maybe there are some neutrals in there, but we are mainly interested in the charged ones. We model it as a fluid. That's what we do in our group. You don't have to. You can also look into the particle motion. But we decide to do the collective approach. So we just treat it as water, let's say, as a charged kind of water. In many cases, these plasmas are magnetized, so they have an intrinsic magnetic field like a permanent magnet would have, which then means, because it is a fluid, that the particles can move rather freely along the axis, which I drew here with the magnetic field vector. So the velocity component which goes along with this vector is not affected, but the perpendicular one feels or sees a Lorentz force and is hence deflected. This leads to this gyrating motion and in overall a helical trajectory for the particle. In such a magnetized plasma, there are many situations that can lead to a formation of coherent structures, like a blob or a vortex. And we are trying to make theory, we are trying to make models that can be implemented, and afterwards we run computer simulations to investigate the structure formation. And you could say that we stare into these plasma simulations until they stare back, which sometimes happens. I am concerned with the evolution of the magnetic field inside these kind of magnetized plasmas. And first we have to define some rules for this evolution and how the magnetic field lines behave. The first and in a very important rule for magnetic field lines is that they have to be closed always. You maybe remember from school that if you have a permanent magnet and you are supposed to actually draw these field lines from the North Pole to the South Pole, they have to be closed. Yeah, like an earlobe, let's say. They look like earlobes in that case. This also holds true for the magnetized plasmas. The field lines, when they meet, so let's say we have two field lines and they get closer and closer and they start to overlap, they can reconnect. But as they always have to be closed, this can only happen in a place where the magnetic field itself vanishes. We call such a geometry, or if we ever see that in our simulations, an X point. Yeah, because for obvious reasons, because it looks like an X, but in the middle, there's actually zero amplitude of the magnetic field. But this is where magnetic field lines can reconnect. And this is another very important thing, the magnetic field as a physical entity itself, it carries energy. And of course, this energy can be converted from the magnetic field into the plasma and hence into the particle kinetic energy, let's say. So it can accelerate these particles, the charged particles of the plasma. The magnetic field lines also carry internal forces like a tension. This is kind of hard to imagine, but let's try to get a better picture for that. In some sense, magnetic field lines are a bit like rubber bands. If we look into this configuration, so we have this rubber band here connected to the nail, and there's this other rubber band that is actually a circle, and it is now really stretched out. So this circular rubber band has 2 points with very strong curvature. And If I cut it now, so if I cut the other rubber band now, I will see obviously that the second one retracts and it forms a circle. So it has some internal tension forces that makes it circular, almost like surface tension on a water droplet. Such a situation where this happens is exactly the same as in the magnetic field lines that can also reconnect and tear apart. And they also form these magnetic islands, these rings of the magnetic field lines. And in that case, I cannot really cut the magnetic field lines apart like I did with the other rubber band, but they can separate in places where the magnetic field vanishes completely. So this is where this cutting apart actually takes place. It's a bit of a trick. The magnetic field vanishes at one point, and this is why it is allowed to reconnect. Let's now try to investigate what this means for a magnetic field in such a magnetized plasma. We normally, or in the simplest way, we try to investigate these things in 2D. Let's imagine this is just a 2D plane and there's a magnetic field within this plane. So on the one side, the magnetic field is pointing upwards, these black arrows, and on the other side, they point downwards. The domain has a periodic boundary conditions, so they are perfectly closed. So everything is kind of fine. But as you see right here is that when they go up here and they have to go down here, somewhere in the middle, the sign has to switch. So we have to go through 0. And actually one can show that this is now an unstable equilibrium. It technically is one, but it's an unstable equilibrium. And if I now perturb this situation, so I give it a small kink, so they are not perfectly straight anymore, the instabilities lead to magnetic reconnection. You remember that the field lines, when they come closer, they are allowed to reconnect, and only if the magnetic field inside vanishes. But this is the case anyway, because we have to go through 0 when we go from the up to the downwards magnetic field. So we have an X point here. And this instability actually acts like the scissor I was showing you beforehand. So this is now tearing apart these magnetic field lines, and they form the magnetic islands, those rings, those water droplets that I described before with the rubber bands. So where does this actually happen? Well, obviously this is the sun, our closest star. And if you think about stars, then you would say, well, they're just the hottest in the core and they just get colder the further outside you get. That's what the basic intuition would say us. But this is only so right, I would say. This only really holds up to the photosphere. So this would be the thing that you can actually see from the sun. Please do not look into the sun without any protection. But this is the thing that you could see. This is where the photons decouple from the plasma, the magnetized plasma that our sun is made of. And outside, there's the so-called corona. That's the atmosphere of the sun, you could say. And the interesting thing now is, and it's the so-called coronal heating problem, is that it gets hotter when you go further outside from the photosphere. It cools down after that again, but there's a region that is actually a lot hotter than you would think it could be. And it is assumed that magnetic reconnection, and especially the transfer from the magnetic field energy into the particle kinetic energy, leads to this increase in temperature. I bet you guys have all seen these kind of pictures where you have the sun and then there are these weird earlobes, these weird curved structures appearing on top of the photosphere. And if you take a bit of a closer look, then you could realize that these are actual magnetic field lines. They are closed, of course, because they might extend into the sun, and they will close. But an interesting thing that we can do now is to try to apply our 2D approximation from before, so this magnetic field that was going upwards on the left side and downwards on the right side, to this configuration. And you could imagine that very close inside, or in this region where the field lines are very tight together, this might even be true. So if there is a small perturbation, which obviously is because the sun is a plasma and the density is perturbed almost everywhere, we could get magnetic reconnection, which then afterwards might lead to a coronal mass ejection. So there would be an island forming out of this thing, which is ejected maybe even towards Earth. But this is not the only place where this can happen. Let's say we have such a coronal mass ejection and this is crashing into the Earth's magnetic field. Then again, we have magnetic reconnection. And this again accelerates some particles, and this might contribute to the polar lights. So this might make them a lot stronger than they are usually. But another place, and this is the place I am personally most interested in, is the fusion reactor. In a fusion device, we have a very similar situation as on the sun. It's a magnetized plasma. We have magnetic field lines present, and of course, they can reconnect. And in these cases, they lead to a shortcut in the plasma, and hence would transport material onto the wall, maybe even make a disruption, so the plasma completely discharges onto the reactor. And this is, of course, highly unwanted. From what I have presented so far, you could get the impression that we have figured everything out. So this is not a big deal anymore. But there are actually a lot of questions open, and we have a lot of puzzles that we did not solve yet and might never solve. And I just want to focus on the one that I am concerned with the most, which is the question of why collision-less magnetic reconnection is fast. So very often, like in any other fluid, you could still model a plasma where the particles collide relatively often. And in these cases, we have figured out magnetic reconnection quite well. But in cases where this is not the case, which actually is the case in the interstellar medium or in the fusion device or the atmosphere of the sun, we don't know why magnetic reconnection happens so frequent and so fast. For the purpose of investigating such collision-less magnetic reconnection, we developed Greenie, which is a C++ code that treats such a 2D configuration of the magnetic field and can simulate the reconnection process. It is available on Git, and it is parallelized with OpenMP and soon with MPI. We are just currently working on that. And it runs on regular workstations in reasonable times, which means a resolution that can be used for a publication runs in less than a day. It is co-developed by my students, Tobias, Alexander, and Manuel. And of course, I'm supervising them in the development and trying to do the theory and modeling part of everything. Let's finally take a look at some simulations that Greenie produced. We can vary different system parameters, and what we do observe is that, let's say, if we change the mass of the particles in the plasma, that we can have very different results. We have cases where we see these two magnetic islands on the boundary, or we have cases where we have multiple magnetic islands. And in these cases where we have multiple ones, we see highly accelerated magnetic reconnection due to the multiple X points where the field lines can actually reconnect. So this might be a feasible explanation for at least a part of the reconnection rate problem in collisionless plasmas. Thank you very much for your attention. Yeah, and I'm happy to answer some of your questions now. Bye bye.